Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Welcome back, True Drews. I hope you guys are having a good week so far. I just feel like this whole month, really this whole year, has kind of blown by. On today's 53rd episode, we're going to be discussing the third Nancy Drew Her Interactive game, Message in a Haunted Mansion. Can I just say, I love whenever I get to talk about the Her Interactive computer games on this podcast, because there's a few less of those than there are the Nancy Drew books, which is why I've kind of spaced them out the way I have. But this game in particular holds a very special place in my heart because it was the first Nancy Drew computer game that I ever played. I think I actually talked about this in my introductory episode when I talked about how I got into the Nancy Drew books and the Nancy Drew games initially, and I remember that day in Target like it was just yesterday, and I was with my mom and my brothers and just happened to be strolling down the computer game aisle, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's a Nancy Drew computer game, and I begged my mom for it, and I was hooked. After that, like, it was history. There was no turning back. Also, for context, this would have been like 2000, 2001, so I would have been like 10 going on 11 years old. I think in one of the episodes I misquoted myself and I was like, yeah, I started playing these games when I was 8. No, I started reading the books when I was 8, and it blurs together. I was like 10, 11 when I started playing the games. So here's a few quick fun facts about Message in a Haunted Mansion. This game came out in 2000, so this game is almost 25 years old, which blows my mind because I feel like it still holds up even today. Like it's got such great spooky vibes, which we're going to talk about in this episode, but it doesn't feel that old to me. Maybe because, I don't know, it feels like just yesterday when I played it for the first time, but it's an amazing game. Now, this game actually sold 97,000 units in 2001, and by the time 2004 rolled around, it had sold 300,000, which is pretty good for a computer game. And this is actually the only Nancy Drew game that had a Game Boy Advance version for it, which is kind of cool. I never played it because I wasn't really on the Game Boy Advance very much. My brothers more were into that, and I was more of a computer girl. And you'll be excited to know, but this computer game is actually based on a book. It's based on mystery number 122, which is also called Message in a Haunted Mansion, and it'll be a while before I get to that one on the podcast, but I have read it, and I can say that it is a fantastic book. It is very similar to the game. So I thought it would be cool to discuss the game cover for Message in a Haunted Mansion real quick, and if you ever want to see these covers for the books or for the computer games, I always post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. So the cover for this game absolutely captivated me as a kid. I was drawn in from the second that I saw it. But we've got Nancy's silver silhouette on the side of the game cover and a spider web behind her. And then Nancy Drew, just her name is just in this gold font at the top. It's gorgeous. And the mansion itself is very spooky. It's a primarily blue game cover. I feel like the first 5 like classic Nancy Drew games, they really themed them with a color. Like Secrets Can Kill was green, Stay Tuned for Danger was a pinkish red, and then we had Message in a Haunted Mansion, and they definitely went for just blue and spooky vibes. But this mansion, it is a Victorian mansion. It's up on this rocky outcropping, and there's lightning behind it, and it's scary, but I also want to explore it at the exact same time. So if I were to rate this Nancy Drew game cover, I would give it 5 magnifying glasses, because I know I'm a little sentimental because it was the first game that I ever played, but it just really captures the essence of this game so well. So now we'll go ahead and jump into the characters that we see in Message in a Haunted Mansion and do some impressions. So up first we have Rose Green, who co-owns this Victorian bed and breakfast with her friend Abby. And Rose is actually the first African-American character that we've seen in the Her Interactive computer games. I think in Secrets Can Kill, Hulk Sanchez was probably Latino, but she's got glasses and she's wearing like a red sweatshirt and very 90s, like high-waisted jeans, and she's usually in the parlor in this game. And then the next character is Abby Sideris, and she is the one that is owning this Victorian bed and breakfast and going into business with Rose. Apparently they were in a theater group together, at least in the book they were. But Abby has like this fiery red curly hair, and she's wearing either a long black skirt or pants and a purple sweater and gold hoops. She kind of has this very late 90s, early 2000s whimsigoth aesthetic, especially her room, which we'll talk about later. Next up is Lewis Chandler, and he is someone we meet about halfway through the game. He's an antiques expert, and he's been hired by Rose and Abby to help finish out the mansion's decor. And Lewis has gray hair and is wearing kind of a blue button-up shirt and black slacks, like he's very business attire. And the last character that we get to see in this game is Charlie Murphy, and he is the handyman that kind of just showed up on Rose and Abby's doorstep one day. He's usually in the basement, and he's wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. He's got brown hair. He's just your all-American guy next door. Okay, I'm gonna do my best and take a crack at these impressions. First up is Rose. We have a busy day tomorrow and no more time for these games, Abby. Abby, do you dare mock the supernatural? Lewis, I'm sorry, but I'm quite busy at the moment. Charlie, I have no idea. Okay, I'm not very good at impressions, and I feel like this game, these characters don't have very distinct voices, so it's really hard, but I feel like I'm gonna really excel when it comes to the southern accents in other games. So there's also some phone contacts in this game, and some of the people that Nancy can call are Hannah Gruen, and I think this is the only game where you can do that, Bess Marvin, and George Fain, and then there's Emily Foxworth, who is a friend of, I think, Nancy's Aunt Eloise. So here are some of the voice actors that provide the voices for the characters in Message in a Haunted Mansion. So first up is the one and only Lonnie Manella. She voices Nancy in this game. Rose is voiced by Janice Page. Abby is voiced by Valerie Mosley. Lewis is voiced by Brian Hargis. Charlie is voiced by Scott Carty. Hannah is voiced by Maya McCarthy, and Bess is voiced by Katie Denny. And then the voice actor for George is Lindsay Newman, and Emily is voiced by Shannon Kipp. Oh yeah, and if Charlie's voice sounds familiar, you're not going crazy. The same guy who voiced Ned Nickerson voiced Charlie. So, pretty cool. Now I'll read a quick game synopsis for Message in a Haunted Mansion. You, as Nancy Drew, go to help Hannah's friends Rose Green and Abby Sideris with their bed and breakfast in stormy San Francisco. Weird disasters have been happening during this renovation, and Abby is convinced spirits are to blame, holding seances regularly. Could Charlie, the new handyman, be to blame? How does Lewis Chandler, the antique expert, factor in? And could this Victorian mansion hold clues to the golden gardenia and a long-lost treasure? So basically the whole plot for this game is you as Nancy go to San Francisco to this bed and breakfast, and you're trying to figure out, are these accidents man-made? Are there ghosts? Like, what is going on? And then, of course, there's the promise of treasure, because we always need a good motive for, like, why these buildings are being haunted. Like in the Nancy Drew books, usually if there's a haunting and there's a treasure involved, it's like, well, there's your motive right there. Like, people are trying to scare people away so they can get the treasure for themselves. And as far as the accidents go at the bed and breakfast, they're not super specific on that. Like, I think some scaffolding fell, and there's a couple things that happen while Nancy is there, which we'll get to. But, you know, Rose is more on the side of, like, these accidents, there's a reason, you know, maybe I wasn't supposed to open this bed and breakfast, or maybe Charlie's inexperienced and shouldn't be our handyman. And then you have Abby on the other side that's like, no, it's ghosts. Ghosts did it. And another thing, when I was replaying this game to take notes for the podcast, I love the old letter openings where Nancy would be writing to Hannah or Bess or George or Ned, and she would just say, "Dear Hannah, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm here solving this mystery." And I love how that really set up the game. And there's, you know, different pictures interspersed, and it's just that was the golden age of the Nancy Drew games. I just love that. That makes them so classic to me. And one neat touch that I think this game did that others didn't, I love how at the beginning of the game you have the shot of the mansion, and the thunder and lightning is just going full blast, and you see this light click on in an upper bedroom, and you know it's Nancy, and she's sitting there writing the letter. It's perfect. So one of the coolest things to me about the Nancy Drew games is finding those hidden things that either reference Nancy Drew books or other games. And there's a couple things in Message in a Haunted Mansion that I wanted to point out. So at a later point in the game, we get to snoop around in Lewis's briefcase, and there's actually a magazine article about Rick Arlen in there. So I thought that was kind of funny. And then when we get to snoop around in Abby's room, we find a magazine about Maddie Jensen. And actually, like, that's probably one of my things that I really like about this game is that we get to do a ton of snooping. We get to snoop around where Rose sits, we snoop in Abby's room, in the library where Lewis is, and even in the basement where Charlie is. Like, no stones are left unturned when it comes to the suspects in this game. I just really like going through people's stuff, okay? I don't know what it is. Actually, I think there's two very distinct types of detectives. Like, I feel like there's some of us that love to snoop on the suspects and have conversations with them, kind of like the criminal profiler type detective. And then there's the other group that would rather solve puzzles and do that kind of stuff. Like, give me a conversation with a suspect any day. I don't want to do Sudoku puzzles. So another thing I love to discuss in these game episodes is the Easter eggs. And if you've never played the Nancy Drew games, which hopefully you have because you're listening to this episode, but it's a literal Easter egg that you find somewhere in the game, and sometimes it can help you accomplish another task, and other times it's just really, really cool for no reason. So the Easter egg that you can find in Message in a Haunted Mansion is after you put the Phoenix Eye back in place on the staircase banister, you can head to the attic and open this chest we found earlier that had an iron in it, and you'll actually see a face that looks a lot like Abby's. And I had never done this before because usually when I do a task, I'm like focused on that one task. I don't run off and do something else, so it never would have occurred to me to even do this, but it's just a cool little thing that you can do when you replay this game. And then another weird thing that you can do is you can go to the parlor after putting the eye in if you don't want to go up to the attic, and you can answer the ringing phone, and a voice will say, "I've fallen and I can't get up." All the 80s and 90s kids know what that reference is, but I thought that was so funny. I want to know, how do people find these Easter eggs? Because I usually play the games the exact same way. Even when I'm replaying them, I very rarely choose the mean dialogue or do something differently. So kudos to whoever figured these out. So another thing that I absolutely love about the Nancy Drew games is the allusions to real life that they put within the games. It makes it just one step closer to feeling real. And so this game in particular, there are all kinds of portraits of actual people. Like, I need to Google image search some of these because some of these I'm positive are like famous paintings or historical figures. And there's also a lot of talk about earthquakes and the gold rush because, of course, this game takes place in San Francisco. I feel like Her Interactive did such a great job, or continues to do such a great job, with educating in a way that's still fun. Like, you would be playing these games as a kid and you wouldn't even know that you were learning something. Like, still to this day, I'll be talking about Marie Antoinette because of Treasure in the Royal Tower. And so I just think it's so cool that we got to learn a little bit about the gold rush and that particular part of history in America. So up next, we're going to talk about the many second chances / deaths that Nancy can experience in Message in a Haunted Mansion. So everyone and anyone who's played this game probably knows this one, but if you loosen the chandelier too much in the foyer, it's not very good. The chandelier comes crashing down and Nancy gets called off the case because she's supposed to be helping prevent accidents or figure out who's causing accidents, not destroy the house. You can also get in trouble for not putting the fire out in time in the parlor. I did this several times as a kid before I figured out where the fire extinguisher was, but I was like, how is this Nancy's fault though? Like, really? Like, because she saw it and she didn't get it put out in time and the fire department didn't show up. But I'm like, is that really her fault? She didn't set the fire. The next second chance you can get is if you're snooping too long in Lewis's briefcase and you get caught, and you can actually get caught also when you're snooping in Abby's room for too long. If she comes back and she finds you, she gets so mad. You can also be forced to do a second chance if you let the villain get away, if you don't figure out how to stop them from getting away, which that's in pretty much any Nancy Drew game. And then I think the only death scenario that Nancy has in this game is if you are going through the secret passageway in the basement without your lantern, you can actually fall in this really deep, dark hole, and it sounds like there's water at the bottom, but Nancy screams, and it's like the most terrifying thing you've ever heard. But I think that's actually the only way you can die as Nancy in this game. I don't know, maybe like after Secrets Can Kill and Stay Tuned for Danger, they're like, okay, we're doing E for everyone. We need to tame this down just a little bit. So up next, I have my notes for the game, and I'm just going to issue a spoiler alert. If you haven't played Message in a Haunted Mansion and you don't want any aspects of the game spoiled, I would probably not listen past this point. We're going to discuss the villain who's responsible for these accidents and a lot of other aspects to the game that might ruin it if you want to play it first. You've been warned. So my first note is something that I've already referenced in this episode, but I absolutely love the letter intros. They're so cool. I don't know what game they stopped doing these on. I feel like it was probably somewhere in the teens of the games, maybe like 13, 14. I'll have to investigate this, but love the letter intros because it really sets up the mystery that we're about to solve. Okay, so my next note is Nancy's room in this game is amazing. It's got this Asian dragon motif and there's tapestries everywhere. Like, I would actually want to stay in this room. Actually, I had a room like this in high school that had kind of this same theme going on. I had like all these Chinese symbols and stuff on the wall. I had no idea what they meant, but I thought it was cool. I also just think it would be really neat to stay in an 1800s bed and breakfast. Like, this Victorian mansion is so beautiful. There's all this wood paneling and just stained glass, and some of the features are just you just don't see that in houses now. Another really cool thing that we can look at in Nancy's room in this game is her floral suitcase. And this suitcase, if you go to Goodwill like tomorrow, you would see a suitcase like this. It's just so 90s. It's got flowers all over it, and when you open it, it's got mom jeans and collared shirts and then this floral journal that Nancy can take notes in, but it's peak 90s. I love that in some of these earlier games they actually gave Nancy a suitcase, because then it just feels even more like you're Nancy and you're in the game, and it's kind of like when you would go to your grandparents and you would pack a bag, and it's just like, we're going on this mystery and we've got, all our 90s clothing with us. So the next thing that I wrote down is El Diablo / Diego Valdez and Lizzie Applegate have a romance right up there with Francis Humber and Dirk Valentine in Secret of Shadow Ranch. So if there's anything that the Nancy Drew games like more than some Nancy and Ned relationship drama, it's definitely a historical forbidden romance, because Francis Humber and Dirk Valentine in Secret of Shadow Ranch, will cover them more in that game, but they weren't really allowed to be together. I mean, when you're dating a bank robber and your dad's the sheriff, that kind of puts a damper on things. And much in that same vein, Diego Valdez or El Diablo liked to rob banks, and you had Lizzie Applegate, this actress who decided to open up this bed and breakfast, but they were kept apart mostly because he was running from the authorities all the time. So not only are we as Nancy getting to stay in this really cool bed and breakfast, but there's the prospect of finding treasure, which we find out plays a strong motive as to why these accidents keep happening. So the next note that I took down is there are some recipes for non-alcoholic drinks in the basement, and they're called Minty Festival Punch and Ginger Whisper, and I honestly want to try these. So I actually mentioned these drink recipes in the bonus episode of my subscription podcast, True Drew Files. I still need to make these and try them and let you guys know what I think, because I think they sound really good. So the next note that I took down while replaying the game is Abby's whole look is a vibe. The earrings, the wild red hair, purple sweater. Like I said earlier in the podcast episode, she is very whimsigoth, and her whole bedroom is like these celestial moons and stars and stuff, and it's just so cool. Abby's a little bit out there with her delivery, but I like her general vibe. So the next note that I took down has to do with one of the coolest scenes in this entire game. But Abby holds this seance in the basement, and it's completely wild. So you as Nancy and Rose go down to attend Abby's seance, and she's put on this purple turban with like a jewel in the middle of it, and you're all sitting around this table with this, crystal ball, and she starts trying to summon the spirit of Diego Valdez. And there's all these spooky things that happen, like a light bursts, and then there's a figure that you see walk past this mirror, like a ghostly apparition of this woman, and it's honestly really creepy. I remember seeing this as a kid, and I was like, oh my gosh. And I should also mention that as this is happening, Abby is asking this quote-unquote spirit all these questions, and there's this spooky voice that answers, and the voice says things like, "Who has summoned me from the great beyond?" And then at the end of all this mayhem, the crystal ball goes really dark, and then Abby is like, the seance is over. And you can tell that Rose is just like not gonna put up with Abby's crap because she just stands up and she's like, I've got a busy day tomorrow and I have no more time for these games. And then she just leaves. And it's funny because after this seance, it's very easy to explain what was going on, but you as Nancy start looking around, and you can look under the table that the seance was held on, and there's like a tape recorder, and there's just things that you find around the house that you figure out Abby was using information she found in these papers on the house. So there's a box full of all these papers and documents that you can look through in the parlor later, and basically Abby just found these names like, oh, Valdez, I'm just going to use that name and work it into my seance. And honestly, like when you know that Abby and Rose were in this theater group together, it totally makes sense because Abby, as far as this bed and breakfast goes, she's definitely into the theatrics, like, oh, we'll tell people that it's haunted and we'll get more bookings that way. And I just get this impression that Rose is very no nonsense. She's like, no, we'll just give them breakfast in bed and it'll, that will help us get bookings. Like, we don't need all the theatrics, Abby. I sometimes feel like Rose and Abby are such an odd pairing. Like, I don't know, like, you picture, like, is this the friend that I would ask to start a bed and breakfast with me? Like, I don't know. Like, either one of them. Rose is almost too practical, and then Abby is almost, like, too far into the spiritual realm. So, yeah, my next note actually references some of the hidden things that were triggered in that seance. And actually, there's a weird, spooky noise that you hear in Nancy's room, and that can be explained by the speaker that's in the vents that is directly connected to Abby's room. And when we get to go snooping in Abby's room later, we find this whole soundboard, and we can play the tape from the seance, and it's got all the pre-recorded dialogue on it. Another thing we can see in Abby's room is this two-way mirror. It's behind a picture, and so she can basically look out at anybody in the hallway, which is really, really creepy. But on the flip side of it, though, there's also some things in this game that you can't easily explain away. I feel like this game did a good job of like treading that line, kind of like Scooby-Doo. It's like, oh, are the ghosts real or are they not real? It kind of leaves it up to the player to decide. So the next thing that I wrote down is I love calling people on the phone. So you actually get to use this old rotary phone in the parlor, which is just really fun. And then I like setting an alarm to wake up. I just love all the old-fashioned technology in some of the games. Like later on, Nancy gets a flip phone or a PDA, but I love it because I remember those days when we didn't have a phone glued to us at all times. It was just it was ancient technology, but it was cool and it was useful for what you needed it to do. So the next thing that I wrote down is Charlie is just hanging out in the basement with his Chinese takeout and his floppy disks. So it's at this point in the game when you get to find this secret passageway through the grate in the fireplace in the basement. And we discover that Charlie has actually been living behind the bar in the basement, and there's a two-way mirror. So he actually saw the seance that Abby put on, and he kind of slips up at one point when you're talking to him, and he says, oh yeah, how about that seance? And Nancy was like, I didn't know you were there. I love when they include dialogue like this in the games and you catch the suspects in a lie. Like, that is just it's just so fun to me. I love, like I said, the criminal profiling kind of aspects to solving a mystery. But I remember as a kid, because during the seance, there's this ghostly figure that floats by with like long blonde hair. And I remember as a kid, when me and my brothers played the game, we were like, oh, maybe it was Charlie and he was wearing a wig. I mean, it was most likely a projector or something that Abby put up, but we had a good laugh over that. But anyways, this nook that we find Charlie has been living in, there's like a sleeping bag and there's this Chinese takeout box. And that's another thing throughout this game. You're picking up on these Chinese symbols and what they mean because they come into play later in some puzzles that we have to do. But we also find the floppy disk that Charlie has his paper on. He's in college, and he wrote this paper on the golden gardenia and this treasure, the bandit's treasure. And so Nancy starts to figure out, oh, Charlie knows about this treasure. Is that why he wanted to work here for Rose and Abby? That's a pretty strong motive if you ask me. Oh, but okay, so this next note that I wrote down, this has to do with something that I picked up on in the insurance letter that Rose has. We figure out that Rose has a lot of fire insurance for the mansion, which is really suspicious to Nancy because Rose has even made the comment, I wonder if this house would be worth more burnt to the ground. But something that I thought was interesting in that letter is that it references vandalism damage to shrubbery, and this refers to how Charlie has been getting inside the mansion. So this might have been a little bit harder to pick up on in the game, but in the book Message in a Haunted Mansion, it directly talks about how Charlie got into the mansion, and it says there was this passageway right behind these bushes. And so even I think Rose or Abby says, yeah, Charlie just showed up on our doorstep one day, and it was right after we were talking about needing a handyman. Well, it was because he was behind the wall and he literally heard every word that they were saying. So I just thought that that was kind of a cool tidbit of information. But of course, the insurance letter just refers to it as vandalism to shrubbery because Rose and Abby aren't aware that Charlie got in the house that way. They don't even know he's staying in the house until he tells them he is. And I can't remember because it's been a minute, but I think in the book version of Message in a Haunted Mansion, they combine a few characters and take a few out. So I think there's actually a character by another name that is sneaking into the mansion. It's not actually Charlie, but don't quote me on that. It's been a second since I've read it, and it'll take a while to get to that one. So the next thing that I wrote down is Lewis and Rose are a thing, and I said, but Lewis is so dull. And they definitely play up Lewis and Rose's romance more in the book than they do in the game, but you kind of catch it in the way that Rose talks about him in the game. She'll just be like, oh, Lewis is so helpful, and it's just like, ugh. I don't know if it's the boring shirt and tie or Lewis's accent or the fact that he just sits in that chair all the time in the library, but he just has the personality of like wet socks to me. And I don't know, maybe since I deal in antiques myself, I was like, I don't feel like this guy's very knowledgeable. Like he should know more about this stuff than he actually lets on, but he seems very pompous too. I don't know. I mean, I know a lot of people have their grievances with Rose too. My main gripe with Rose was just, I would be like, oh, cool, I found something in the attic, and she'd be like, I'm too busy, I can't come look at it. I was like, but it's in this property that you bought. Don't you want to see this? Like, this could lead to a treasure. Oh no, you don't want to move from this one spot that you're always in? Okay, I'll just let you shuffle these papers around for the millionth time. I mean, if I owned an 1800s bed and breakfast that I was renovating and I had this teen detective that was like, hey, I found something in the attic, I would want to go check it out, personally. Oh yeah, and so one of the things that Rose tasks us with doing is going and scraping these ceiling tiles off. And so when we do that, we find this door to the attic, and we have to find the key to get in there. But once we get up there, there's a lot of cool things that we can use to solve other puzzles in the house. And we actually get stuck up there, and you have to use a crowbar to get out. But I remember as a kid being like, oh crap, I'm never going to get out of here. So the next thing that I wrote down is the newspaper in the basement says affordable housing is unavailable, and I felt that. And I know this game came out in 2000, but this just seems like a very today kind of problem. And what's wild about this is Rose and Abby put their life savings into this mansion. And, in 2000, I don't know what the house, market was like in San Francisco, but It couldn't have been cheap. It was probably still like $1 million house. So now I don't even know. I don't even want to know what it would cost. So the next note that I have down is the door to the basement slamming when you turn around is freaky. So I remember having this happen as a kid. You would go down to the basement after Charlie had left to snoop around and steal his screwdriver because it's important. And you would turn around and look back up the steps and the door would slam really quick. So it was like somebody was following you. Ugh. I love when they include things like this in the games too, because it just freaks you out. I don't know. It's simple things like that, like feeling like you're watched, really adds to that feeling of danger in the games. So this next thing I have in my notes is actually something that Abby says, and she says Pax Vobiscum, which means peace be with you. I had to look this up because I failed Latin in high school. Actually, are the V's pronounced like W's? I can't remember. It's a dead language for a reason. So the documents that I was talking about earlier in the parlor, those end up getting set on fire, and this stressed me out so much as a kid. I think I remember like running over to the phone and trying to call 911 because I was like, I don't know what else to do. That's what my parents told me to do if there was ever a fire at our house. But you actually have to find this fire extinguisher, which is in this other cabinet, and you as Nancy just put all this foam all over it and put the fire out. So now all those important documents about the house are destroyed. So whoever destroyed them knew that there was something important in them and didn't want anyone else to see it. So it's not long after this that we can figure out how to get behind this bookshelf in the library. There's like a secret passageway that you can activate by pulling this little thing by the fireplace. And I loved this because there's a portrait and you can pull the eyes aside and look through and spy on people. And so we get to spy on Lewis, and he finds this book on the bookcase and he goes, I can't remember what he says. He says something like, Eureka, or I found it. He gets really excited, which for Lewis is a big deal because the man is never excited about anything. And so he puts it in his briefcase, and so we get to go break into his briefcase. And this was almost as stressful as trying to put that fire out. It was stressful in a different way because when the fire is going on, there's all this high, intense music playing. And I don't feel like it was as intense when we're trying to get into Lewis's briefcase, but it was scary because it was like he could come back at any moment. But you get in there and you find this book and you flip to a page and it says Gumbo Foo, which means gold treasure mansion. So why would Lewis be excited about that? Unless he thinks it's referring to possibly this mansion, which we're starting to get every indication that this mansion is or was the Golden Gardenia where Lizzie Applegate and Diego Valdez would have had their rendezvous. But of course, Nancy doesn't know what Gumbo Foo means. It just says Gumbo Foo. So she starts going around and asking different people like Rose and Charlie, like, what does Gumbo Foo mean? And she contacts Emily. Emily Foxworth is one of the phone contacts. But when she goes to ask Lewis about it, he gets super defensive and he's like, where did you hear about that? So then as Nancy, we have two options. We can either say, I read it in a book, and then we immediately get booted from the case. Or we can say, I read about it in a magazine. And then Lewis proceeds to say, oh, it means house of books. But later, when Emily Foxworth gets back with us, she says, no, it means golden treasure mansion. So Lewis lied to us. And why would he do that? So it's at this point in the game when Abby, Rose, Charlie, and Lewis are supposed to be going to some kind of a Christmas festival or something. And I thought it was really rude that they didn't invite Nancy. But anyway, Rose says, oh, I took out the tapestry from your room. It's being dry cleaned. So we are able to see this part of the wall that wasn't available to us before. And it's got all these Chinese zodiac symbols on it. So we can get into that. And then there's a safe. And at this point, we find this ruby. And Nancy's like, this looks a lot like the one that's in the phoenix head on the staircase downstairs. So based on the poem on the wall hanging that Rose had dry cleaned, we can figure out when we need to put this ruby back in the phoenix's head, because the poem just says, listen, my child, to the story of dreams and know that the beginning is more difficult than it seems. When the 10 daughters are reunited in order, when the 4-sided box loses its border, when the eye of the phoenix is in your hand, when the bird of fire can see again, when the moon sleeps and the sun plays, the king of the sky will shine his rays, and hidden beneath a river of colors will lie a gate to golden wonders. So basically, in layman's terms, we need to put that ruby into the phoenix's head when the sun is shining outside, and when we do that, this light comes in through the stained glass window, hits that eye, and then hits a spot on the floor, and that is where the rainbow is. And underneath that, Nancy is able to get this crowbar and pry the floorboards up, and she finds this treasure. But of course, Nancy doesn't have a long time to gloat because the villain shows up and whacks her on the head. And who is it but not Rose, not Charlie, not Abby, but Lewis, that super dull guy who was like, I don't own a store, I own a gallery. Even snobs like treasure, apparently. So do we remember that chandelier that I talked about in the second chance and death part of this episode? So as Nancy, you're able to go up there, and you have to go up a certain set of stairs, because if you go up this other staircase, there's a squeaky stair and it'll alert Lewis that you're trying to sneak away. And so you go up there and you pull the cord as many times as you can, and the chandelier will fall on Lewis and capture him. And I never noticed this. I actually saw this on Reddit, but somebody pointed out Lewis Chandler is his name. Loose chandelier, Lewis Chandler, like, oh, that's hilarious. So we're finally able to catch the bad guy, and Rose and Abby are able to finally finish renovating this bed and breakfast without any more accidents. So really quickly, I thought it would be cool to talk about all of the hauntings that we see in this game, because there's quite a few, and some of these we're able to explain away as Abby doing them, but some of them we can't explain away. So some of the hauntings that we can attribute to Abby is the weird noise that comes through the vents into Nancy's room. We find out that that's a speaker that's connected to her room. There's also these dead roses, and we see those in the parlor, and then we see them in this chest in Abby's room when we snoop around. And then there's this ghostly laughter that we find on a laugh track on Abby's soundboard. There's also a note that Nancy gets shoved under her door about halfway through the game that says, "Leave the mansion now," but we can probably attribute that to Lewis. But some of these other things aren't as easy to explain. So there's a ghostly woman that we see in the upstairs hallway, and we hear her crying. And we also see her in the two-way mirror downstairs during the seance. There's the closing basement door. Was that somebody following us, or was that something ghostly? We don't know. And there's a weird mandolin that plays, and these shades move in the parlor. I don't see how Abby could have rigged that. There's also this bird head on the bottom of a table in the parlor that moves, and there's no way you could fake that. It's really weird. There's also this garbled voice that calls on the phone when you pick up at one point. There's shadows by this door in the entryway, which it looks like somebody's walking past the glass, but then you open the door and there's no one there. And there's also this chair cushion in the foyer that it slowly rises like somebody was just sitting in it. There's also another thing that we could classify as a haunting, but it's these flickering lights in the room that Rose is in. So, I mean, you could explain this away as like, oh, a power surge or something was wrong with the electricity. Or was it a ghost? And the last haunting, and my absolute favorite, is the blinking portrait on the staircase that says, "I see you." I remember this as a kid. It just freaked me out so much. I was like, oh, like I looked forward to it every time I'd play the game, but I was also terrified of it. Especially when you consider that we as Nancy can get behind that portrait in the library and spy on people. It makes you think, is there another secret passageway that someone's looking at me through that picture? Ugh. So yeah, a lot of these things are not explained in the game, and like I said, it's kind of left up to the game player to decide, was this something that a human did or a ghost did? It's delightfully spooky. So the next thing that I like to do in these game episodes is take down some of the funniest quotes, and these were two of my favorites. So this first quote is attributed to Emily Foxworth, and it's in one of the phone conversations she has with Nancy, and she says, "Riding a camel is not as easy as it looks." And this next quote is from Nancy herself, and I love how sassy Nancy was in some of the earlier games, but she says this to Abby when Abby's talking about ghosts, and she says, Well, you'll be the first to know if I find a ghost floating over my bed. Like, for somebody who wears mom jeans, Nancy has some of the iciest burns. Now, when it comes to some of the best and worst puzzles in Message in a Haunted Mansion, I said I love puzzles where you have to get out of things, like the attic. I loved being stuck up there and having to figure out how to get out. And I like it better when it's not timed, because if it's timed, I feel really stressed. But if I have like ample amount of time to figure it out, it's not so bad. I also really like some of the psychology stuff in these games. I like when you have to say the correct things to suspects or they'll catch you in a lie, or I love catching them in a lie. That is really fun to me. And as for some of the specific puzzles, I really like the Chinese zodiac puzzle on the wall in Nancy's room. I love the stair puzzle where we have to put Diego's name and we get that roll of music and that little Ponzi symbol. And I really like the slider puzzles. I know a lot of people don't like those, but I think they're super fun. But I feel like this game, there wasn't really any puzzles that I didn't like, and I feel like there was a good balance between interviewing the suspects and figuring out puzzles. So now we're to one of my favorite parts of these game episodes. We're going to talk about the music, and I love the music in Message in a Haunted Mansion. Like I said, this is the first game that I ever played, but man, they really hit it out of the park with just this music. It fits the aesthetic of this creepy old mansion perfectly. So this first track is called Abby. It's very ethereal and spooky. This next track is just the Message in a Haunted Mansion theme. This track is called Saloon/Seance, and it just fits the mood of the basement because there's this player piano down there, and it's just the best. It just sounds like echoes of the past, people playing years ago in this dusty old mansion. It's just so cool. This next track is called Attic, and I think this is my favorite one from the entire soundtrack. This next music plays in the dining room, and it's very creepy piano aesthetic. This next music plays in the entryway of the mansion. And this last song plays in the parlor. So overall, if I had to give this soundtrack a score, I would say 5 magnifying glasses. It's one of the best. It's one of my favorites. And I know I'm biased, but I would give this game a overall rating of 5 magnifying glasses. It's an older game, but it's a classic, and it's so good. Like I said, there's a great balance between puzzles and interrogating suspects, and there's hauntings, and there's fake hauntings, and just, it's such a good game. So yeah, that concludes today's episode for Message in a Haunted Mansion. If you haven't played this game, I highly recommend it. It's a great one to start with. And if you haven't read the book is actually really good, and I can see why they based this game off of it. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about another Nancy Drew book, The Crooked Banister Mystery. So if you like robots that try to attack people and houses that could only be described as a death trap, then you won't want to miss this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at truedrewpodcast.